Hi, I'm Jack. Before we get started with today's video, I just wanted to talk to the fans of Lynyrd Skynyrd. I don't know what you guys are called. I just wanted to be upfront and honest that in today's video we're going to discuss Lynyrd Skynyrd and Sweet Home Alabama, but at no point are we going to make fun of them, say that they're bad musicians, or say that their fans, the Skinnies, are wrong for liking them. I myself wouldn't consider myself a Lynn head, but I like their music. I think they're very talented musicians. I Know a Little is a favorite of mine. So rest assured that we're going to be taking your band very seriously today. So you're in safe hands, skinheads. Okay, I think that was it. Let's talk about the stars and the bars they dropped.
I saw a cartoon and I saw black, tall white mansions and little shacks. Southern man, when will you?
Today we're going to talk about Neil Young. And yes, I know what the title of the video says, and yes, I know that Neil Young did not write Sweet Home Alabama. If you're a fan of Lynyrd Skynyrd, you already know where this is going. Everybody else, you'll see. Neil Young is a Canadian singer-songwriter who, depending on who you ask, is best known as a solo act, backed by his backing bands Crazy Horse, The Stray Gators, and Promise of the Real. He was a member of Buffalo Springfield, of Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, and he's been called the godfather of grunge. There's a lot of different facets to Young, and the YouTuber Polyphonic did a really good video about him, which I suggest you check out if you want to know more. As a songwriter, Young writes a lot of protest songs, and he's very blunt with his messaging. Over the years, he's written Let's Impeach the President about George W. Bush, Rockin' in the Free World, which criticizes George H.W. Bush, and Ohio, which criticized Richard Nixon's response to the Kent State protesters. The verse goes,
10 soldiers and Nixon's coming. We're finally on our own. This summer I hear the drumming. For dead in Ohio.
Young does not like to mince words. Shortly after the release of Ohio in 1970, and recorded around the same time, Young released the album After the Gold Rush. I highly recommend listening to it, not for the point of this video, but just because it's very good. Only Love Can Break Your Heart and After the Gold Rush being favorites of mine. Today we're just going to focus on the song Southern Man, which is about the racism and white supremacy that Young observed in the American South. The song opens with the lines,
Southern man, better keep your head. Don't forget what your good book said.
Here, Young's calling out the hypocrisy of those who claim to be religious while holding white supremacist views. Young doesn't cite a specific line of the good book, but I'm sure between whatever you did not do for the least of these you did not do for me, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, or you shall not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were all foreigners in Egypt, you could find something to suggest that Christianity and white supremacy should conflict. George Wallace, the then governor of Alabama, says the word God 27 times in his 1963 inaugural address, nowadays best remembered for the line, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. So the people Young is talking about certainly do exist. Young then sings,
Southern change gonna come at last. Now your crosses are burning fast.
This line is referencing the practice of the Ku Klux Klan of burning crosses on the front lawns of black homeowners. This practice, meant to threaten and other black people, continues to this very day. Here Young is warning the Southern man that change is coming and that they will soon be out of crosses to burn. One detail I find interesting is the pairing of the imagery of the burning cross and the good book, further cementing that hypocrisy, and I hope it's clear that both Neil Young and myself don't think that the hypocrisy is the problem. Young then talks about the condition of the South, noting the cotton, tall white mansions and little shacks, screamin' and bullwhips crackin'. Historian Zachary J. Lechner, in his article Journey Through the Past in the History Classroom with Neil Young, points out that Young's imagery is not of the contemporary South, but rather of the Gothic South. Much more 1870s than 1970s, he notes. And that's an interesting thought. By using older Southern imagery, what is Young trying to say? Is he simply incorrect, making assumptions about what he thinks the South is like, but his only frame of reference are books from the 1870s? I suppose you could argue that. We'll get back to it. You could argue that Young's doing it on purpose. By comparing the then and now, he's trying to make the statement that things might be better for black people now. They aren't all that different than the days immediately following the abolition of slavery. The next verse says,
Lily Bell, your hair is golden brown. I've seen your black man coming round. Swear by God I'm gonna
this verse, Young assumes a character, a Southern man. The name Lily Bell is not a reference to anything, but is rather using lily as in the flower and belle as in the Southern belle archetype to let the listener know that Lily Bell is a delicate white woman who's in some sort of romantic relationship with a black man. The narrator then responds by swearing that he's going to kill that man. This is in reference to lynching, as mobs often killed black men for accusations of raping, sexually assaulting, or otherwise having sexual relationships with white women. Interracial marriage was illegal in the South until 3 years before this song was released. On May 12, 1970, 4 months before this song was released, Henry Marrow was killed for making lewd comments at a white woman. So it's safe to say that Neil Young's not wrong with what he says in Southern Man. Then in 1972, Neil Young released his acclaimed album Harvest. That's right, we're not done talking about Neil Young. We won't spend too long on this song as it covers a lot of the same points as Southern Man. One thing to note, Young sings,
I'm from a new land, I come to you and see all this ruin. What are you doing, Alabama?
And to briefly geek out about that rhyme scheme, wow. What's important is that Young's acknowledging he's not from the South, these are just things that he's noticed. Whew! Alright, now we're ready to talk about Lynyrd Skynyrd. We all see the flag. We don't have to talk about the flag. Southern rock band Lynyrd Skynyrd released the song Sweet Home Alabama in 1974, 4 years after Southern Man and 2 years after Alabama. Frontman Ronnie Van Zant begins the song by singing,
Big wheels keep on turning, carry me home, see my kid, singing songs about the Southland. I'm a Alabama once again, and I think it's a sin.
The big wheel that keeps on turning is meant to be evocative of the band's constant performance schedule, supposed to represent the wheels of their tour bus. It's also a reference to the song Proud Mary by Creedence Clearwater Revival, a song which glamorizes the South despite the fact that the band is from California. We're so close to everything coming together. Van Zant also uses the word kin in this verse to further illustrate his Southern pride, as that's a common slang term down there. He concludes the verse by singing songs about the Southland and how he misses Alabama. Next he sings,
Well, I heard Mr. Young sing about her. Well, I heard O'Neill put her down.
He name-checks Neil Young here, so it's safe to assume that this is meant to be some sort of response to Young's songs. In fact, in this performance, Van Zant is wearing a t-shirt with Neil Young's 1975 album Tonight's the Night on it. Now, because this song is about Alabama, you might assume it's just a response to the song Alabama. But there's an interesting moment in the studio recording where you can hear Southern Man being played gently in the background. There's been deliberation over the years about whether or not it was Neil Young's actual recording or if it was producer Al Cooper doing a Neil Young impression, but in any event, they reference Neil Young, Alabama, and Southern Man. See, this all ties together. This is why I had to spend the last 3 minutes white-splaining hate crimes. There's a point to it. So what does Van Zant have to say to Neil Young?
Well, I hope Neil Young will remember. Southern man don't need him around anyhow.
Hope you all caught the reference to Southern Man. If not,
Southern man.
so, a Southern man don't need him around anyhow. Van Zant is essentially saying that they don't need Neil Young's criticisms. And I think there's a couple of layers as to why he says this. In interviews, Van Zant has criticized the tone of Neil Young's songs, calling them condescending. Young has agreed to this in interviews, and I guess that's a fair criticism. I don't think that the song Southern Man stopped anyone from being racist. But it seems to extend to the idea that if you're not from Alabama, you can't, or at least shouldn't, criticize the people of Alabama because you don't know them, which I agree with less. He's going to elaborate, and we're going to get back to that idea. We're not going to spend too much time on the chorus, as lyrically there isn't too much there. Van Zant sings the word home a lot. What interests me most is the placement of the chorus. Immediately after telling Neil Young that the South is working to fix their problems, they reaffirm how cool the South is. Which is an odd way to make that statement. I wanted to apologize for the comments that I made back in 1963. They were inappropriate. I have learned, and continue to learn, that my words carry weight. And so I wanted to apologize to everyone who was hurt when I said, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. I hope you can forgive me. But anyway, besides that little blip, I'm fucking awesome. Kick it! Ronnie, you have to understand that tonally that's going to send an odd message. Unless you meant it ironically. But I've done a lot of research and I can't find a source that would suggest you mean it ironically. The next verse begins with the line,
In Birmingham, they love the governor.
Now, I'm not going to be the first to point out that it's interesting that Van Zant references Birmingham rather than Montgomery, the capital of Alabama. Birmingham is best known for the Birmingham Campaign, a series of civil rights demonstrations that were met with violent clashes by the police. So I feel like in Birmingham, they don't love the governor. And I already hear you say, well, what about the boo-boo-boos? You're not referencing the boo. You're being disingenuous if you... stop strawmanning Leonard Skinner. Don't worry. I should point out that following the line about loving the governor, Van Zant says... He said in interviews that that line was meant to be ironic and they're actually making fun of the governor. I don't think that was conveyed as effectively as they were hoping. The next line...
Now we all did what we could do.
Does imply that we do not love the governor. Don't know who we are, but it even goes so far as to imply that we try to stop the governor. Two thoughts? From what? Getting elected? Segregation? But we had trouble because of the people of Birmingham? Second, if they did all they could do, but they still weren't able to stop him, that means they might need help. But Van Zant has already said that a Southern man don't need him around anyhow. Curious. The next two lines say,
Now Watergate does not bother me. Does your conscience bother you? Tell the truth.
Here what Van Zant is saying is that he does not feel responsible for Watergate. Even though Richard Nixon was the president of the United States, Ronnie Van Zant didn't do anything wrong. Should a person be held responsible for the crimes of their government? Which is an interesting thought. But coupled with the previous two lines seems to imply that he doesn't feel responsible for anything the South did wrong, which... we'll get back to it. For the rest of the song, he continues to talk about his sweet home Alabama. So let's take it all in. What do we think about what Lynyrd Skynyrd is saying?
Sweet home Alabama. Lord, I'm coming home to you.
Some may point out that I didn't talk too much about the relationship between Young and Van Zant. A lot of ink has been spilled over the years about the feud between the two and how legitimate it was. Personally, I don't care. It seems like they liked each other as musicians and songwriters. I'm more interested in what the songs have to say. And I think Sweet Home Alabama has 3 big points to it. First, that Alabama is fucking awesome. Second, that if you're not from the area, we don't need your criticism. And third, the people of Alabama should not be held responsible for the crimes of their government. We're not going to answer all of these in a YouTube video, but we're going to explore these questions and we'll invite conversation in the comments below. First, Alabama is not fucking awesome. I was going to show a bunch of numbers and news articles that'll prove that Alabama's not awesome, but I'll just say...
Lasting education. Before we die, need healthcare.
Second point, if you're not from this area, we don't need your criticism. Now, if I were a worse video essayist, I'd just point out that the members of Lynyrd Skynyrd are all from Florida, and then I'd spend the rest of this video announcing a Patreon. And while it's an interesting part of the story, I don't think it matters all that much that Van Zant is white knighting for a state he's not from. So it isn't the fact that Neil Young's not from Alabama that's the problem. It's that he's not from the South. He's never lived in the South. He doesn't know what it's like, so where does he get off on telling us what we're doing wrong? It almost feels like Van Zant is channeling Bob Dylan's line from The Times They Are A-Changin', don't criticize what you can't understand. Because Sweet Home Alabama is not just about Alabama, even though it is now their state song. It's about the entire South. In the same way that Neil Young's Alabama was not just about Alabama, it was about the entire South. The things that Van Zant says apply just as much to Alabama as they do to Florida, to Texas, to Mississippi, to Georgia, to the Carolinas, to Louisiana, to Kentucky, to Arkansas. If I didn't say the name of your state, you're legally not in the South anymore. I don't know what the answer is in this circumstance. Certainly Van Zant underplayed the issues that Young was criticizing, and Young was right to criticize them. But both Young and Van Zant agree that he generalized the problem. And I do doubt that Southern Man or Alabama convinced anybody that structural racism is wrong. Maybe it's people like Van Zant, who understand Southern culture, who need to write songs about societal issues, which is something he avoided for the most part. Third point, should the people of Alabama be held responsible for the crimes of their government? And I don't mean held responsible in a legal sense. I don't think every single person in America in 1974 should have gone to jail because of Watergate. I don't think every person who voted for Richard Nixon should have gone to jail because of Watergate. But Watergate wasn't a position that Richard Nixon ran on. That was something he did, and tried to do without anyone knowing. Segregation was a central tenet of George Wallace's beliefs. In his 1963 inaugural address, he said, "Segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." So should those who voted for George Wallace feel responsible for his policies? I mean, those who are for segregation certainly should. But not everyone voted for him because of segregation. What about their economic anxiety? Can Neil Young really be mad at those people? I mean, sure, the segregation wasn't a deal breaker, but I'm sure they didn't mean it. Can Neil Young really be mad at those people? Can Neil Young really be mad at those people? Tell the truth.
Well, Mr. Van Zandt sang about us, and then we made it our state song. He said it's meant to be sarcastic, but we still sang it all night long, don't get it wrong. Last in education, the 49th in healthcare, the 45th in economy and crime and correction.